Hello, I'm Bev Neufeld, president of PowHer New York, and I welcome you to today's webinar. It's actually the 14th annual New York State Equal Pay Day commemoration. I hope you were able to sign in easily, and you have gotten a link so that you can follow the slides. Unfortunately, Zoom is not working as well as we hoped, so we will not have the slides present, and you'll be able to see all the speakers talking. We'll tell you what slide we're on as we move forward. I want to thank all the volunteers who work on the Equal Pay campaign. You make it happen. Special thanks to Abby Grimshaw, our online manager, and to Nancy Hafner and Mary Luke, who helped organize today's webinar. We really appreciate it. This year is different, and we all know that. Instead of meeting in person on the steps of City Hall or sitting together at one of our many forums, we're holding our conversation online today. The coronavirus is having a profound effect on our lives now, and it will have unknown effects on women's economic well-being in the future. What it has done is it's exposed the deep flaws in a system that leaves women often underpaid, undervalued, and now under siege. We're going to dedicate this webinar to all the women workers who are protecting us, caring for us at very strong personal risk and low wages. You represent the struggle for equity, and we'll continue fighting for better wages and working conditions for you and all women when this moves forward. So I think we're on slide 5. And just to kick it off, just an overview on Equal Pay Day. You probably all know that Equal Pay Day is the day in 2020 that the typical woman, working woman in the US, has to work to make as much money as the typical man. That's 3 extra months work for just 12 months of pay. And it reflects the 82 cents on a dollar. And of course, women of color, the gap is much, much larger. Here in New York, we have one of the smallest wage gaps, but here too, for women of color, the disparity is huge. Throughout the year, we're going to dig into the disparities for particular groups, but today we're going to touch on some of those. We're on slide 6. Our panel today is going to explore the causes of wage inequity, the effects of COVID-19, the obstacles for the particular groups, the legislative reactions we've had that are helping solve some of the problems, and then next steps. On slide 7, it's just if you have a question, put it in the chat box or send your email to info@powherny.org. So let's get started. Our first panelist is Dr. Nicole Mason. She is the new president and CEO of the Institute for Women's Policy Research. The Institute is a leading think tank, and it conducts and communicates research in a really way that people can understand it. And it inspires public dialogue, shapes policy, and of course, it's improving the lives of women. So Nicole, can you take us away and talk a little bit about, and give us an overview and some of the new research that you are, that you're doing right now?
So thank you so much, Bev. I'm really excited to be here. As you said, I am the new president of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, and this is actually my first Equal Pay Day in that role. And so I'm really, really, really excited about the conversation that we'll have today, but also the work we are doing at IWPR with our coalition partners to really think about what the pay gap means in the lives of women across the country. We launched, last week, we launched an ambitious Equal Pay Day campaign. But as you know, the pandemic has really caused us to not only think about the impact of the equal pay, of the wage gap, in the lives of women and families, but has also started us thinking about what does an economy that works for all women look like. So Bev started out with some statistics about the 82 cents on the dollar, statistics that we all hear. What we know is that given the current wage gap is that it'll take about 39 years to close the gap, and we know that the gap has slowed. And for Black and Latino women, what we know is that it's going to take more than a century. For me, what that means is that my daughter and my daughter's daughter will not see pay equity in their lifetimes. So there's so much I think we can do, and we'll have this conversation here a little bit and hope to hear from you all about what we can do to accelerate the closing of the wage gap. The current pandemic has highlighted not only the fragility of our healthcare system, but also our economy as well. Many low-wage workers are bereft and without adequate resources to get them even through 2 weeks without pay. What we know is that lower wage workers are also less likely to have paid sick leave, the flexibility to not work, or savings to tie them over. What does this mean for equal pay or for the pay gap? When there's a disparity in the earnings and wages of women compared to men, women are more economically vulnerable and insecure at times like this. It's less money in their pockets to provide for their families, buy basic necessities, and get through an economic financial crisis, which we find ourselves in today. When we look at the wage gap by occupation and sectors, what we see is that in every occupation, with the exception of about 5 out of 125 or 150 occupations, the earnings of men outpace women, even in sectors where women dominate. And so what that means is that there are very few professions that women out-earn men, even when they have equal skills, equal talent, and apply equal effort. What we know is that what this means is that over a lifetime, women will lose more than $1 million in earnings to the pay gap. And Latina and Black women will lose 3 to 4 times more. During our Equal Pay campaign, we really tried our hardest to highlight, again, what the loss of earnings or these earnings mean to women in their lives. And what we know is that it's less money to save with, less money for retirement, less money to provide for their families. And then when we look at the intersections of race, gender, ethnicity, gender identity, and also circumstances, we know that undocumented women, transgender women, and formerly incarcerated women face additional barriers in relationship to employment, but also the pay gap. It's estimated that transgender women, the pay gap is 40% more once they transition. And so in our work at IWPR, we're really trying to work to highlight the experiences of a diverse group of women, and so that when we are talking about the 80 cents on the dollar, we can understand very clearly what that means for women and populations and groups who are often left out of the conversation, and really creating a very intersectional analysis in terms of understanding the impact of wage inequality and the pay gap on women, families, and communities. One of the things, and I'm going to turn it over to our other speakers in a minute, but in terms of thinking about solutions, what this pandemic really brings up for me, and I think in our work, is that the economy that as it's currently been configured is not working for most of us, most working families, most single mothers. And so we have an opportunity to really think about what kinds of policies, what kind of strategies, how we connect with employers and businesses to make sure that we build an economy or create an economy that works not just for the few at the top, but for everyone. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I look forward to the discussion following the other presentations.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nicole. You're doing some really great research, and we'll be sharing that later too. So next up, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of the particular groups that we've already mentioned. And I'm really proud to have us start off with Jaclyn Dean. She's the policy manager of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. That is a mouthful, which is the only organization focused on building power with Asian American Pacific Island women and girls. And you're using, I understand, a reproductive rights framework. So Jaclyn, give us some of your insights.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that introduction. So I'll just be talking about how the wage gap impacts Asian American and Pacific Islander or AAPI women. So I'm now on slide 11. Contrary to the stereotype that Asian American and Pacific Islander women are high achieving people in, professions like the medical profession as doctors or as lawyers, AAPI women actually make up a disproportionate amount of the low wage workforce. So they're 2.9% of the overall workforce, but 4.4% of the low wage workforce. And they're overrepresented in particular industries such as personal care, service, retail, and restaurant industries. And as you'll notice, those are a lot of the industries that are suffering a lot due to the pandemic, and a lot of industries that have had to lay off a lot of workers that are disproportionately AAPI women, and I should just say women of color generally. And I know that's been brought up before, and could be emphasized as every opportunity we get. So AAPI women are, we're very economically diverse community, and we're overrepresented in the high wage workforce, but we're also overrepresented in the low wage workforce, and we occupy all ends of the spectrum. But no matter what, on both ends, we experience a wage gap, because we know that with more education and the higher up we move in a lot of these professions, the wage gap tends to be exacerbated. Moving on to slide 12, this is a very important point that NAPAWF tries to bring up every year during AAPI Equal Pay Day, which is that even though on average AAPI women make 90 cents to the white male dollar, which is higher than the average for women generally, once you disaggregate that data by ethnicity, you see that there is, again, quite a range of experience in wage gaps. So at the very top, you have Malaysian and Taiwanese and Indian American women making well above the dollar compared to the white male dollar. But then once you move down, you also see that Cambodian, Burmese, Nepalese women are making as low as 50 cents to the white male dollar, which means that they have to work twice as long to make what a white male makes. So this is data from the National Women's Law Center. It updates every year and it changes a bit, but you can really see how there's so much diversity within our community, and that disaggregating this data by ethnicity shows us a very different picture than what this model minority myth wants to tell us. And so we are always emphasizing the need to disaggregate this data as much as possible so that we see the full picture and ensure that all of our communities get the attention and the resources that they need in order to achieve equal pay. Moving on to slide 13, the wage gap also differs when we break it out by state. And so I think in an earlier slide, it was brought up that AAPI women in New York, women in New York make 85 cents to the white male dollar. And for AAPI women, that's 83 cents to the white male dollar. Again, that's different from that 90-cent figure that we see on average. And Alaska, which actually has a pretty significant AAPI population, they make only 54 cents to the white male dollar for those in Alaska. And in Hawaii, as we know, there are many Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities, as well as AAPI women generally, and they stand to lose almost $800,000 in their lifetime because of the wage gap. So again, as Nicole pointed out, there are so many different factors at play and so many different ways we can break this down, and it's really important to see how all of our different communities are affected and why it's so important to disaggregate and dissect this data, and so that we get the full picture. Moving on to slide 14, one of the solutions to helping AAPI women get equal pay is to unionize. And so this graphic is from the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. And they have data that says AAPI women who are unionized make 11% more a week than women who aren't unionized. And so we know that unions generally have a very positive effect, in the bargaining power and getting wages higher for everybody, and that includes AAPI women. And that's something that we at NAPAWF support and, propose as a solution every year during AAPI Equal Pay Day. So thank you for listening. And if you want to find out more, please visit our website. It's napawf.org.
Thank you so much, Jaclyn, for that overview of a very complex group of people, actually, so that I'm really glad that you broke it down so clearly for us. We're up to slide 15, and I'm really excited to introduce Janice Brown. She'll be addressing the obstacles to success for African American women. Janice is the president of the New York State chapter of AAUW. That stands for Association of American University Women. You're all giving me a really hard time with these long names, but we got it right, I think. AAUW is a grassroots organization which has been empowering women for 130 years. They're a leading voice in the equal pay movement, and I have to say they've been amazing partners to PowHer New York and the Equal Pay Campaign. Thank you, Janice, for telling us a little bit about African American women in New York.
Thank you, Bev, in PowHer New York. First, I would like to say, as a licensed nurse that's not actually practicing, I want to personally thank all the healthcare workers on the front line fighting this epidemic. And I also like to paraphrase a statement from our CEO, Kim Churches of AAUW, on the COVID-19 pandemic. She said, it's creating a shift in our lives and in our economy. Our hearts go out to everyone impacted by the virus in this crisis. AAUW is doubling down on our efforts to fight for the economic security of American women and their families, as we've done for over the past 140 years, Beverly.
Oh, I'm sorry. I took it from your website.
These issues we've been fighting for are now very urgent. And of course, it's with low wage workers, which are mostly women, and again, with part-time workers, which is the majority women. We're confident that this crisis will eventually lessen and we can move on with society and move forward and taking on the fight of insecurities of women. So today, I would like to speak about the impact that African American women face with equal pay as it pertains to economic security of women, education, and the job market with African American women. Most of the information I'll be talking about and the data that I'm sharing comes from research that AAUW has done with the simple truth about the gender pay gap and deeper in debt. So African American women, I can't see the slides, but I'm gonna kind of paraphrase what's on the slides. African American women experience both the race and gender wage gap, which in intersectionality. They're confronted with very unique situations in the workplace. One, African American women are definitely devalued in the workplace. And then you have the biases of race and gender as well. We have the occupation segregation, that's an issue, and the resistance to structural changes, as well as the perceptions about the importance of the certain types of work that African American women endure. So just right off the top, the fight with race and gender automatically puts African American women at a disadvantage. And when we talk about being a disadvantage, we're always, most of the data looks and compares the statistics of African American women to white, Hispanic men, but also we're, as African American women, are at a disadvantage when it comes to African American men as well. So regardless of our education, the number of years of experience we have, or the type of job, how many, we're always at a disadvantage. And then when we talk about equal pay day for African American women, early we said tomorrow officially we're celebrating for the average woman, but for African American women, we won't celebrate equal pay day until August, which is an additional 8 months compared to white non-Hispanic men. So when it comes to economic security, women of color make up about 35% of the workforce. And some statistics say that the age for women of color in the workforce now is from 25 to 54 years of age. That's the biggest age gap right there. But even with that, in African American women, you know, having that much, that large of a percent in the workplace, we are still placed in those low paying jobs. And between 1997 and 2013, the statistics said that to get away from the low paying jobs, we're looking at becoming entrepreneurs. And the percentage of African American women-owned business has drastically increased to over 258% since 2013. So we're looking at owning business as a way out of getting out of the low disparities when it comes to equal pay. So moving on to education. Education is a factor. Although a high quality education is a prerequisite, African American women are doing that, but also we're taking out student debt. We're going to school, getting educated, but we're taking on debt. And we take on more than 2/3 of the student debt. And because of that, we are having, again, hard time getting good jobs and a hard time repaying those debts back. Same thing in the job market. We are always stagnated in careers because we're at those low paying jobs. And a lot of times African American women take on these jobs because it's a must have to due to their family situations at that time. And again, as Elisa said earlier, with the statistics, over the course of a lifetime of an African American woman, she loses over 1.4 million in salaries compared to a man. So in concluding, AAUW is helping women to overcome these pay inequalities by learning how to negotiate your salary. So we are committed, AAUW is committed to training 10 million women to learn how to negotiate their salary. And you can start by doing that today by logging on, going online to salary.aauw.org and do that workshop online. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Janice. That's so much information. I guess with equal pay, it'll be a lot faster to pay off those debts. So it just was one example of the difference wage parity makes. We're on slide 22, and I'm very happy to introduce to you Elisa Chartis. I met her on Latina Equal Pay Day last year. and really pleased that you'll be here to talk about some of the issues around the Latina community, particularly new trends around entrepreneurship. Elisa co-founded Latina Surge National, which is connected to Lean In, and its mission, of course, is to empower Latinas to create diversity and inclusion, gender parity, and executive boards in government, corporate America, and higher education. That's a big job ahead, Elisa. So tell us some more about the Latina community and what your observations are.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, PowHer New York, for including Latina Surge and our Latina Latinx perspective. I just want to give a little shout out to our Vice President, Estela Rizzuto, who's participating today. And we have a regional reach here. It's not just New York, but New Jersey and other surrounding states. Dr. Katia Goldfarb is also participating, and she heads up the multicultural Latinx affairs for Montclair State University. So I'm excited that all of this rich information that we're all sharing today is going, obviously disseminated through New York, but also our surrounding states. So, obviously we want to emphasize that we should all be talking about equal pay with everyone. Awareness is key on this issue. It's still staggering and sometimes shocking to know that there are still women and women of color who are unaware of the pay gap. So I really commend all of the women here today in their efforts to create awareness and outreach on this issue, because the first step is awareness. And at that point, we can then move forward and address being proactive through negotiation, training, and things like that. Collective responsibility is something that Latina Surge emphasizes over and over again. We need to know the data out there. We need to know it on supplier diversity, on performance for different corporations, and we can then only self-empower knowing that data and utilizing it via purchasing power. We shouldn't be leaving, there's multiple reports annually that are published by like Nielsen, Catalyst, McKinsey, Seher. There's numerous reports every year, and we discuss equal pay every year, but we as women tend to let those reports sit on the shelf for the rest of the year and collect dust. We really need to utilize that data, talk about that data, share the data, and act upon the data. It's 2020. For us as Latinas in the Latinx community, it's almost impossible to imagine that there's still close to a 50% differential in pay. We're doing everything we can to address this. And this status quo over the year to year throughout the decade has really helped to support the momentum towards self-employment and also entrepreneurship. Latinx businesses now, given the circumstance, are even at greater risk. So Latino women in general have taken that extra step to leave corporate America because they weren't finding their way to equal pay or to wealth generation, and they decided to self-empower and move into entrepreneurial endeavors. And now this is a big risk to our community and something that we really feel that is critical to address. And there are a lot of different programs out there now that we're seeing on loans and bailouts, grant programs that are being offered at the state level and at the federal level. But we really need to know whether these are realistic and these are accessible by our professional community. I guess, when we talk about our current reality, there are some positive impacts. Those include innovation. There will certainly be innovative growth. Clearly, communications have been outstanding to date, I would think, given where we are today versus where we were maybe at the last catastrophe of 9/11. Negative impacts, of course, layoffs. I'd love to know who's getting laid off and who's tracking this. I think that the onus is on government to see which individuals are filing for unemployment and seeing what those trends are. How many people are women? How many people are women of color filing? We need to definitely track that and see what the trends are here. As for students, what's the loan assistant profile looking like now? Internships are being canceled. How does that affect work study programs and financial aid? And who's also getting these grants? Who's getting these loans? We need to find out who's actually getting access to them and tracking that. And then, in terms of those who are staying in corporate America, obviously there are layoffs, but there are definitely going to be people who are going to get promoted because they're taking on more responsibility as layoffs occur. Who are those people that are being identified for those promotions? And what's the profile in terms of how many women are being included in women of color to that end? So ultimately, I would say that from our perspective, there definitely needs to be some kind of action plan. We would recommend a 3-point action plan to be implemented, addressing who's getting laid off, obviously by tracking the data, and who's being promoted. Number 2, supplier diversity pipeline. Right now, there's so many emergency contracts that are kicked into full gear. How many are MWBEs? How many are participating? How is government and corporate America ensuring this participation? I haven't heard anything from any governors. Obviously, we're focused right now on critical communication on healthcare, but also there should definitely be some communication along with these loans and grant programs as to what the participation is and what the emphasis is here for main contractors to utilize subs that are MWBEs. And then third, the loan and grant aid. How are the federal government and the states going to ensure coverage for women in home-based businesses? This is a critical component that Latina Surge is now advocating for. In the last 5 years, with technology advancing exponentially, so many women have gone into their own businesses and have home-based businesses, but none of these apply to the loans and grants that are currently offered. So how does that again create a disparity for our community of women and women of color?
That's a really interesting point, Elisa. That's a really interesting point.
So I think that these are the critical issues, and it's time to close this pay gap, especially as it relates to what's happening today.
Great. Thank you so much. I think these are questions that we have for post-COVID, the coronavirus pandemic, and we don't want all this to push us back. We have to keep pushing forward. One group that's really overlooked in the conversation around economic inequity are the rural women, and there are many rural women in New York. Donna Seymour is going to talk about that. She's a native of the North Country, and she's been working on women's issues for years. She's now the host of North Country Matters, which is a local video news magazine. She's also a board member, been a board member of PowHer, and a key volunteer on the Equal Pay Campaign. So Donna, please share some your observations around women, rural women, and the wage gap.
Thank you very much, Bev. As Bev mentioned, North Country Matters is a local video news magazine. It's now in its 16th year. Over the course of each season, we've looked at many of the issues that rural New Yorkers face and struggle with every day. In 2017, we did a show about the ALICE project. ALICE stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. This project was initiated by the United Way of Northern New Jersey several years ago to bring focus to the families and individuals who work but whose salaries do not provide sufficient resources to meet basic needs. Other states have since adopted this model and methodology, including New York. The report acts as a bridge between the Great Recession of 2008 and 09 and the economic meltdown we're experiencing right now in New York as a result of the coronavirus. Slide 29. Yeah, a typical Alice family struggles to meet 5 basic household necessities: housing, childcare, food, transportation, and healthcare. They are the working poor. Many of the Alice barriers are really societal problems, like too many low-wage jobs, rural transportation limitations, and the lack of quality, affordable childcare. Yet in America, society tends to blame individuals because they can't make ends meet in their own lives. The Alice report gives a county-by-county snapshot of just how people struggle in our rural counties. Sadly, the economic problems of rural New York can't be solved by equal pay alone. Low-wage jobs tend to ensure low wages for all the workers, regardless of gender, societal, or educational background. Slide number 30, please. Of all the 62 counties in New York, 24 are classified as rural, and many of the others have significant rural spaces within them. Mostly they tend to clump together geographically in certain areas around the state, and rural counties were already stretched thin to provide the supplemental help that many of these Alice families needed before the current crisis. Living wage jobs are out of reach for too many New Yorkers. 90% of the jobs in New York State pay less than $32,000 a year, according to the Albany-based New York Association of Training and Employment Professionals. Slide 31, please. Before the coronavirus shut down much of the economy, a recent Brookings Institute report found that 53 million Americans between the ages of 18 and 64 accounted for 44% of all workers who qualify as low wage. A majority of these workers are adults in their prime working years, and the low wage work they do is their primary way of supporting themselves and their families. Women, people of color, and those with low levels of education are the most likely to stay in those low-wage jobs. The Alice report that points out that many families are just one crisis away from economic disaster. That economic disaster is here, and it is affecting nearly everyone. In early March, 1/5 of all jobs had already been affected by the coronavirus emergency, and much of that impact has been at the low wage end of the scale. In short, many women have no resources to weather any crisis, especially the dramatic loss of income from this pandemic. Here in New York State, the Department of Labor announced more than 80.5 thousand unemployment claims were filed just last week, the first week in which the claims were impacted by the virus. This is an increase over the past year of 520%, and initial claims for unemployment insurance increased by a minimum of 284% in each of New York's 10 labor markets. Slide 32, please. American society is finally facing the consequences of the lack of living wage jobs, sick pay, and health care, which are critical benefits in a public health crisis like this. New York and the federal government are starting to grapple with this lack, although there is much work yet to be done to make it fair and cover every employment sector. And yet, we see some hope. Even with the widespread layoffs in every sector not considered essential, there are job postings in those essential businesses. Some traditional low-wage employers have opened their wallets and are paying out bonuses to their employees in these difficult times, offering higher wages, and many are hiring. Will these higher wages last? Although some of these employers claim these wages are temporary to meet the current emergency, it will be hard to roll them back now the genie is out of the bottle. What we have seen in states like New York and a handful of others is a strengthening of the social safety net that is happening quickly on a variety of fronts. These include eliminating any waiting period for unemployment benefits, opening back up state-based healthcare systems for the newly uninsured have lost their health coverage along with their jobs, and setting up emergency sick days here in New York to be followed, we are told, by a permanent system in the state budget this year. There's also now a widespread understanding that childcare is an essential service and a driver of the economy, particularly for workers in healthcare and other essential occupations. The last thing our overburdened healthcare workers need is to struggle to find safe and adequate childcare as they perform their critical duties during this pandemic. Slide 33. As Albert Einstein once said, in the midst of difficulty lies opportunity. Rural folks are good at making something out of very little, and new business models are being created daily that take into account the needs for social distancing and no physical location. Relocalizing the economy may be another positive outcome of the pandemic. Essential services are local services, and people who can find ways to meet a local need are well on their way toward creating a new income stream. Home-based or cottage industries are springing up all over, but we must remember, as Elisa just pointed out, that we need to make sure that the grants and the other supports are going to businesses like that, not just the brick and mortar businesses. The current public health crisis is having the positive effect of bringing national attention to the inequities of our current economic system. States like New York are moving quickly to address these inequities. Our job will be to see that these solutions become permanent for everyone. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Donna. That was a really excellent overview of an area. PowHer is a statewide network, and we are looking at all parts of the state. So thank you for always bringing that up and sharing that. And if you can look at the documents that we sent, the links to the slides, you'll see one of Donna's cartoons that she often has online. So thanks, Donna. I just want to remind people to please send in any questions through the chat box, or if that's not coming up and you're on the phone, send questions into info@powherny.org. Abby's collecting those, and we'll take some questions after the next section. So I really appreciate the panel has talked about these many insights into obstacles for different groups. And PowHer, the network, has been looking for concrete solutions, responses that really try to break down obstacles. They're often legislative responses, and we're hoping that through them we can level the playing field, as we call it. So we're on slide 35, and I'm really proud to introduce Seher Brafman, Senior Policy Counsel at A Better Balance. Seher is really the legal force behind the legislation that we passed in 2019, which she's now going to discuss. A Better Balance has been an incredible partner and leading the charge nationally and here in New York to help families working on paid sick leave, paid family leave, flexible time, of course, pay equity, and other policies, including pregnancy and family status. So Seher, please share some of the things that we've been doing together and why they're so important.
Thank you so much, Bev, and thank you for convening us, and for everyone who is on this call right now. I hope you're all and your families are safe and well. So I am going to focus on some major policies that New York has moved forward over the last few years, particularly in 2019. But before we move into that, just a bit of background, as Bev mentioned, A Better Balance is a national legal advocacy organization. We're based in New York City, working to support all women and working families, especially those who are most vulnerable and exposed to unfair workplace policies. And equal pay legislation is on the forefront for us, as are policies like paid family leave, like paid sick time, and the emergency legislation that we're also advocating for. All of these issues are interconnected. They all contribute to unequal pay. Motherhood, we've mentioned so many different intersections of unequal pay. Motherhood and pregnancy is another interplay in unequal pay and gender inequality. And that's something that we focus particularly on as well, in addition to inequality based on race and based on gender and based on family status. So, I encourage folks. A Better Balance has also set up a specific resource page on COVID-19 and on workplace policies that we're both advocating for and that have been passed, including New York State's emergency paid leave law and the federal laws that have passed both last week and the week prior. And if there's really one takeaway from my presentation specifically, it's that A Better Balance is here pushing for legislation, but we are also here to support workers. We have a free confidential legal helpline where any worker, if you are working in communities where folks don't understand their rights and need help, we are here to help, and we're here to try to talk workers through what their needs are and how the law may be of assistance to them. So moving into specifically the equal pay legislation that New York has moved forward, and we've been proud to lead with PowHer on. In 2019, really we saw a movement on two very major pieces of legislation. One was around expanding how we think of pay discrimination. For so long, we've thought of pay discrimination as, you need equal pay for equal work. And what we've really seen is that that's been very limiting. And what we really needed was a model where we thought about equal pay for substantially similar work, because what we were seeing in the law is basically employers say, well, if they don't have exactly the same job, then they deserve unequal pay. But we know that's entirely untrue. And we know that there are plenty of people who are doing work in very similar jobs that are deserving of equal pay, but not getting that. So a huge change in the law was to update the law to say that employers have to pay people equally for both equal work and for substantially similar work. And the second big piece of that was that we were really limiting ourselves by saying, well, pay discrimination is based on paying men and women unequally. But what we know is that people are being paid unequally for a variety of reasons. A Black woman might be being paid unequally both because she is a woman of color and because she is a woman. And so the law was updated to say you can't be paid unequally based on any protected class that you are in, comparing that to someone who's not in that protected class, which means that if a woman of color is being paid less than a white woman, that too can equal pay discrimination, because we know that race is a key factor to unequal pay as well. So that was a big change in the law too. We have that you are not allowed to be paid unequally for substantially similar work, and if you are in a protected class, not just based on sex. So that was a huge update in the law. And then a second really big update in the law, some of you may be familiar with, many states and cities around the country are banning inquiries on salary history, which means that an employer can't ask you, if you're interviewing for a new job, what you made in a previous job, because we know that women and people of color historically start earning less from the outset of their careers, which means that if an employer asks you what you made in a previous job, then and for instance, they just say, well, okay, I'll pay you 5% more than what you got in your previous job, then that's going to perpetuate wage inequality, because women and people of color are historically paid less from the outset. So that follows them from job to job, and we know can be a driver of wage inequality. Now, New York City in 2017 passed a ban on asking for salary history. And I think it's important to note, it's not just a ban on asking what you made in a prior job, but it's also that if an employer is able to find out that information, they can't use that information to set your salary. So it's not just about asking for the information on the application, but an employer also can't seek that information from an outside source and then use that to set your salary. And New York State hadn't yet passed that, even after New York City did. And in 2019, thanks to the efforts of a lot of people on this call, New York State did pass a ban on asking or relying on salary history, and that law is now in effect. And we're really pleased to see and hopefully see the change that results because that law is now in place. So those two are really the two sort of major buckets that were passed last year. And I should also flag that in 2015, there was a real concerted movement as well to strengthen and close loopholes in our equal pay laws. That was through the Women's Equality Agenda. And one particular piece of that I want to note is around salary and wage sharing among employees. There's often been a phenomenon where if employees share their salary information with one another, employers will retaliate against them or penalize them for having done that. And in New York State made very clear that you cannot retaliate against someone if they want to discuss what their colleague is making, because often that's the only way to find out if you're making less, and you shouldn't be fearful of talking with your colleagues to see if you're being paid less. And the last note I'll end on is just that A Better Balance has two resources that I would highlight. We have a New York Working Women's Pocket Guide, which is really meant to be a kind of one-stop shop for a variety of different issues, including equal pay. So if someone has a question about whether they think their rights are being violated around this or around paid leave or around pregnancy discrimination, the guide, and it's in digital form and is updated constantly based on changing laws, is meant to be as a resource for workers and advocates as well. And we also, I would highlight, have a specific Know Your Rights toolkit on these two laws that I just mentioned. They have very detailed FAQ sections, thinking through the different permutations of the law, the differences between the New York City and the New York State laws, as well as different examples, especially around this question around the newly expanded pay discrimination and what it means to expand based on protected classes, because that really is a novel way of looking at pay discrimination. And we want to lay out specific scenarios for how to think about that form of discrimination. So I would encourage folks to check that out. And again, if anyone has questions, obviously you can email me directly. And if you work with communities and you're hearing from workers who have questions, again, please feel free to direct them to our free confidential legal helpline. And now I'll turn it back to Seher.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that explanation. And afterwards, we'll be sending around links to those documents that you're talking about and the guides. I just want to say, some people are having trouble getting the slide deck. And so I just wanted to assure you that we will send it around after with links to a lot of this information and ways to contact panelists. And just last chance to send in any questions, because as soon as Seher gives us a really, really exciting update about what we're doing next, we'll try to have some time for questions. So really, you're gonna wrap it up, Seher. Seher Khawaja is a senior attorney for economic empowerment at Legal Momentum, which is the oldest gender justice legal advocacy group in the United States. Very proud to have you here. And we've been working with Seher and the Equal Pay team on what's next. What are we gonna do next to really try to break down these barriers for all women? So Seher, tell us a little about it. And I believe you're starting on number 45, right? Okay, so we're on slide 45. Let us
Okay. Well, thank you, Bev, and to PowHer for bringing us together for this very important conversation. We're reminded by the current circumstances that when a crisis unfolds like this, those who are most financially vulnerable, including women, are typically hit the hardest, which drives home the importance of tackling the pay equity problem. As Bev mentioned, I'm an attorney at Legal Momentum, the Women's Legal Defense and Education Fund. It's a women's rights organization that's been working for about 50 years now to advance gender equality through the law. And in our work, we found that achieving legitimate pay equity for women and other marginalized groups requires a comprehensive approach that addresses the multiple factors that contribute to the persistent wage gap. And other speakers have covered many of these more in depth, but I thought I'd provide some context for the legislation that we're going to speak about by providing an overview about some of these contributing factors. So we have overt discrimination and implicit bias, lack of transparency surrounding compensation. So that means that employers take advantage of secrecy around pay to create salary discrepancies. We have unequal distribution of caregiving responsibilities and the issue of pregnancy. There's occupational segregation, which is one of the hardest to tackle. And we're also looking at overall depressed wages for workers. Moving on to slide 46. The women's rights community and lawmakers have been drafting and enacting legislation to tackle each of these factors. And Seher discussed key victories from the past years, which will hopefully go a long way towards addressing the systemic discrimination factor as well as others. Today, I'm going to provide an overview of legislation we are working on to address other contributing factors, namely the transparency issue and the bias, implicit bias issue. The bill we're working on in New York State, as well as counties and cities in New York, is a compensation range disclosure bill, which would require employers to do several things. First, it would require mandatory disclosure of compensation for any employment opportunity. So all private employers in New York State would have to disclose in writing or electronically the compensation or range, the benefits, and other form of compensation when issuing a new employment opportunity. That could be in a job posting, a flyer, an email. Second, it would also require disclosure to current employees. So an employer would have to provide that same information to existing employees regarding their current position, and they would have to do that at several junctures. There would be an anti-retaliation provision, so an employer couldn't refuse to interview, hire, promote, or otherwise penalize anyone for asserting their rights. The bill would require DOL enforcement, so the New York State Department of Labor would have to create a complaint mechanism, investigate violations, impose civil penalties, amongst several other things. And it defines range of compensation as the range that an employer actually relied upon in setting compensation. And there are various details as to how that can be figured out. Moving on to slide 47, as I had mentioned, the purpose of this bill is to address several of the contributing factors to pay inequity. So first, one of our main goals is to eliminate overt discrimination and implicit bias in salary setting. Too often, employers inject their overt or implicit bias into the hiring process, factoring in an applicant's gender or race when setting compensation amount. This may be done consciously or unconsciously, but studies have shown that women are offered lower salaries because some employers think men are more competent, often white men, that men are more competent, or that women are less focused or committed, often because of pregnancy or childcare obligations. Proving discrimination in this context can be extremely difficult. And so one key purpose of our bill is to eliminate the opportunity for employers to use gender bias, racial bias, and other forms of bias to shape their salary decisions. A second main goal is to enhance transparency to level the playing field for women. And through various studies and based on our own experience assisting women through Legal Momentum's National Helpline, it's evident that women applying for new positions who are in the dark about salary are likely to ask for less. And this is in part driven by the fact that women have historically earned less and thus typically have less leverage in negotiating salary. And that's part of the goal of the salary history ban that Sarah mentioned earlier. Research also shows that women are more willing to negotiate and more successful at negotiating when applicants are informed about compensation, benefits, or conditions of employment. So providing this information about salary upfront creates transparency that's likely to put women in a better position to negotiate and advocate for themselves. And this also applies more broadly to people of color.
So Seher, how are we going to get this done?
Exactly.
ride, right? and we're almost out of time.
I know, and I'll be quick.
No. What are we going to do?
We're on slide 48. So obviously legislative priorities have shifted, but the pandemic has also shed light on the urgent need to address these underlying inequities. So as we try to push forward to enact this law in New York State, there are several things that individuals and advocates can do to support this initiative. You can engage in outreach with your legislators and policymakers in your county or at the state level. You can share information about the benefits of this type of legislation with your network, raise visibility through social media and communications platforms, and really just educate your peers about the importance of pay transparency. I think part of the purpose of this bill is to start really changing the culture of around how we treat pay and how, you know, all the secrecy surrounding pay, and to really break that wide open so we can create more opportunities for women and people of color.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Seher. Really appreciate that, and all the work you're doing to pull us together around this very new legislation. Throughout the year, we're going to be sharing a lot of information. We want people to take this to the voting booth, find out where legislators stand on our issues. What are they going to do to make sure we keep moving forward on women's economic equality? So thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but we're all coping. And I just want to wish you, you know, to stay healthy, to stay sane in the weeks ahead, and stay in touch. And we'll end our webinar there. And thank you for joining us for the 14th Annual Equal Pay Day in New York State.